Hello, crafty friends. This is Anya General with Ink, Paper, Scissors. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm showing you 17 different techniques using embossing folders. Embossing folders can be inexpensive, so it's a great crafty tool in our arsenal for creating beautiful cards. There are two different types of embossing folders out on the market, 2D and 3D embossing folders. A 2D embossing folder is also called a standard embossing folder. It is a bit thinner than a 3D embossing folder. It is more shallow and provides even pressure across the design. Essentially, it creates only one level of raised design, and it is more subtle. A 3D embossing folder is deeper and creates multiple levels of embossing. It adds real dimension and has a more realistic and layered design. 3D embossing folders are more bold and give a lot of dimension. They are also sold at a little of a higher price point. Each type of embossing folder needs a different sandwich with your die cutting machine, so make sure to check your instruction manual. I will be using the Universal Plate System by Spellbinders today, as that is my go-to for embossing folders. And all my techniques will be done on 3D embossing folders today. Because I am using 3D embossing folders, some of these techniques will give you perfect results, while others give you a more distressed or vintage look. If you don't like the look of a specific technique, try a different embossing folder. You may be surprised how different each technique may look with a different type of embossing folder. So give it a try and see what look you love most. Also, since this video focuses on techniques, I will not be creating any cards today, but I will spend the last minute or two of this video showing you cards that I have created with some of the techniques I've demonstrated today. Let me know in the comments which technique is your favorite and which card you love most. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel, then hit that notification bell so you never miss a video. Also, I've linked all the products used in today's video below and on my blog, where you can find even more details and resources. Now let's jump right into the techniques. The first technique is double embossing. I am using a regular A2 panel of Neenah Classic Crest cardstock in my Tufted 3D embossing folder by Spellbinders. Then I run it through for a second time, but this time I use the Petunia Cascade embossing folder by Spellbinders. And the result is beautiful and interesting. The area where the second embossing folder was blank, you see the tufted design from the first embossing folder. This is such a cool technique and one of my favorites. I will be using my Spellbinder Platinum 6 for all of my 3D embossing folders today. I will be using the following sandwich for most of the techniques I will be demonstrating. Platform A, then my embossing folder with my cardstock, and then adapter plate D on top. Be sure to check and follow your machine's instructions carefully when using embossing folders. My second technique is embossing folder stamping. So for this technique, I am using the raised area of my embossing folder to stamp onto the cardstock. For this technique, I am using Lisa Horton solid gold ink, and I am inking up the raised area of the embossing folder. Then I place my paper carefully into the embossing folder and close it. You could spray some water on the stamped area to allow the ink to flow better and set on your cardstock, but I did not want a distressed look today. Therefore, I did not use water for this technique. For best results with this technique, it's best if you repeat this process until you get the coverage you want. For the sake of time, I only did it once, and honestly, I love how this looks. It gives the embossed area a lot of interest. This technique would be perfect for wedding cards or even for sympathy cards on darker cardstock. My next technique is the direct-to-folder ink swipe technique. For this technique, I used watercolor paper and one of my Altenew ink pads. I swiped the ink pad all over the indented side, which is also called the negative side of the embossing folder. Then I spritzed it with water a couple of times, added my paper, and ran it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6. I sprayed the inked side with water in this technique because I am filling a large background with ink, and I want the ink to spread out and fill the whole background. I repeat this process again to make sure that I have good coverage. I have 2 tips for you here. First tip: it's best to lock your paper in place with the design on the opposite side of the embossing folder before you add the ink to the negative side. This allows you to act quickly once you spray the background with water. Second tip: if you stamp the ink pad all over the negative side rather than swiping it, you will get more ink onto your cardstock. Keep this in mind when using this technique. I will demonstrate that a little later in the video with darker ink. The next technique is embossing folder ink blending. Here, I am working again on the negative side or indented side of the embossing folder. I am taking a small detailed ink blending brush to add ink to my flowers on the embossing folder. I use darker ink in the middle for dimension and lighter ink on the outside of the flower. I also add green to my leaves. I then spritz it with water and put my paper inside the embossing folder. Then I run it through my Platinum 6 with the same sandwich I mentioned earlier. This technique works best if you repeat it several times. I decided to ink blend a little bit of green on top of my leaves with my detailed ink blending brush to show you that you could do that also to add color to your results. For this next technique, I'm using vellum. This is a translucent, delicate paper that embosses beautifully. I start by trimming my vellum to 3 inches by 3.5 inches. I'm using the Tufted 3D embossing folder here, but this technique works just as well with 2D embossing folders. I place the vellum inside the folder and then run it through my die cutting machine using the correct sandwich for 3D embossing. Vellum is prone to tearing, so don't force it if the sandwich feels too tight. You may need to adjust your pressure by removing a shim or using a lighter plate. When it comes out, the vellum has picked up all the detail from the folder. Just look at that texture. It has a soft, ethereal look. It's really cool. A small tip here: keep in mind that adhesive can show through vellum, so I usually attach it by hiding glue behind the embossed areas or using tiny dots of liquid adhesive in corners. Next, I'm embossing patterned paper. And this is one of my favorite ways to give new life to older paper in my stash. I choose 2 different patterns. The pattern should not be too bold or busy because the embossing will add its own texture and detail. I place the patterned paper inside my embossing folder called Dimensional Diamonds and run it through the machine. I've decided to use a geometrical pattern to show you how impactful this folder can be on patterned paper. When I open it up, you can see how the raised design adds dimension to the pattern. It gives it depth and makes it look almost like custom printed cardstock. I repeat this process with a leaf patterned paper and the Leafy 3D embossing folder by Spellbinders. Again, the embossed leaves give the paper more interest and texture, but they do not overpower the design. This technique is great for quick backgrounds and really helps stretch your patterned paper stash. Let's move on to Yupo paper. Yupo is a synthetic, plastic-like paper that's typically used with alcohol inks, but it also takes embossing beautifully. So I am using a background that I created with my alcohol inks a while ago, and I am using the Floral Fans 3D embossing folder. I cut my Yupo paper down to 4 inches by 5¼ inches and place it in the Floral Fans embossing folder, just like with any other cardstock. Once embossed, the Yupo shows the texture really well. I take a sanding block and lightly sand the color off the raised areas of my design. You want to be careful and gentle here, not to tear the paper. I just love the look and will have to use this technique more often in the future. This technique is what I call the faux halo effect, and it's incredibly soft and dreamy. I start with a piece of light pink cardstock and place it inside the Floral Fans embossing folder. After running it through the die cutting machine, I gently swipe a white pigment ink pad across the raised areas. You'll want to use a light hand here. Just skim the surface to catch the raised pattern without filling in the recessed areas. The result is this beautiful hazy highlight over the pink background that almost glows. It's subtle, elegant, and adds just the right amount of contrast for a romantic or vintage look. The next technique is heat embossing. For this next one, we're combining dry and heat embossing in the same panel. I start by applying anti-static powder to an A2 panel of mint green cardstock. This is really important to avoid stray embossing powder. Then I place the cardstock inside my Field Notes 3D embossing folder and run it through the die cutting machine. Once the texture is in place, I lightly dab a Versamark ink pad across the raised areas. Next, I pour on some halo embossing powder and tap off the excess. Then I take a fine detail brush and brush off the excess powder that is sticking to my cardstock in areas where I don't want it. Next, I heat set my panel. After heat setting my powder with my heat gun, the raised pattern came to life with this gorgeous, shimmery dark green finish that looks like custom foil work. This technique works especially well with bold or open designs that have lots of raised surface to catch the ink. Number 10. Brayer inking. Brayer inking is a great way to add smooth, even color to your embossing. And here I'm showing you 2 different versions using the same folder. First, I embossed 2 panels with the Dimensional Diamonds embossing folder. For the first one, I roll Altenew mauve ink onto my brayer and apply it across the raised geometric pattern of my cardstock. This highlights the top layer of the design. Then, on the second panel, I flip the cardstock and ink the opposite side. This time I am using Arctic Ink by Altenew. On this side, the larger geographic areas are inked, so the pattern looks totally different. Side by side, you can see how each direction gives a totally different look. One emphasizes the raised diamonds, while the other creates a shadowed, almost letterpress-like effect. Brayer inking gives you great control, and it works best with pigment or hybrid inks that don't dry too quickly. This next technique is all about elegance and contrast. I started with an A2 panel of dark blue cardstock and embossed it with the Cross Weaves 3D embossing folder by Altenew. Then I added a little bit of Simon Hurley's Lunar Paste in the color Slippery When Wet onto my brayer. You want to use very little paste here. I overdid it a little, so I had to brayer some off on a scrap piece of cardstock. Then I rolled the brayer gently over the raised surface. The gold catches just the top layer of the pattern, leaving the recessed areas dark. It adds this amazing metallic pop that feels really high-end. I find this technique works best for mixed media cards, as the look always comes out a bit distressed. It is possible to get clean and crisp results, but that would depend on the embossing folder and its depth. For this technique, I start with a piece of watercolor cardstock and emboss it using the Petunia Cascade embossing folder. The heavy texture of watercolor paper gives beautiful definition with this design. Once it's embossed, I smoosh a few ink pads onto my glass mat to create a palette. Then I spritz some water into each color and then use a damp brush to pick up the ink and carefully paint over the raised flowers and leaves. The embossed lines act like natural barriers, making it easy to stay within each shape. If I color outside the lines, I am not too concerned. I will show you in a bit why. After coloring everything in, I set the panel aside to dry completely. Once it's dry, I place it back into the embossing folder. This time, I ink the opposite side using a stamping motion with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink. I carefully align the panel, close the folder, and run it through the die cutting machine again. This adds a deep black shadow into the recessed areas, creating contrast and visual depth. I repeat the inking and embossing step until the background looks rich and fully developed. This layered approach gives a gorgeous mix of color and contrast. It almost looks printed. You don't need embossing folders to get an embossed effect. Stencils can do the job too. For this example, I'm using the Star Bright stencil by Spellbinders, along with a silicone embossing mat. I place the cardstock on top of the silicone mat, lay the stencil over it, and build the correct sandwich for embossing. For the Universal Plate System by Spellbinders, this is Platform A, Platform B, the silicone embossing mat, my cardstock, the stencil, and adapter plate D. Always check your machine's guidelines to be sure. I run it through the die cutting machine, and when it comes out, the stencil design is beautifully pressed into the paper. The result is subtle but noticeable. You get all the intricate detail of the stencil, but with a raised texture instead of ink. What's really great is that you can go a step further and use the same stencil to add ink over the raised areas for even more impact. This technique is perfect for adding dimension without adding color, or as a textured base layer underneath techniques like ink blending, foiling, or even heat embossing. This next one is called faux embossing, and it's a great trick for when you want a textured look but don't have embossing folders or stencils. I am using the Texture 2 die by paper rose and die cutting it 3 times out of white cardstock. These texture dies don't cut out shapes, they just add design elements like lines or patterns. I love this collection by Paper Rose. It's very useful for any type of card. I glue all 3 layers onto a white A2 card panel, carefully lining them up next to each other to build dimension. Because everything is white on white, the texture creates the look of embossing, even though it's actually die cut. It's clean, crisp, and has a modern feel. Plus, you can control exactly where your texture goes. This technique is perfect when you want precision placement or are looking to add subtle texture that won't overpower the rest of your design. We are already on number 15. For this technique, I'm using a regular die, but instead of cutting with it, I'm embossing. This technique works with any intricate die and an embossing mat. I place the Infinity Punch and Pierce Plate by Spellbinders over my cardstock, with my silicone embossing mat underneath and the correct sandwich from my die cutting machine. When I run it through, the die presses into the paper instead of cutting through. It leaves behind a beautifully detailed impression that looks elegant and refined. You can use this as a background or a subtle frame for a sentiment. So even if you own a die that does not cut well, use it with an embossing mat and you may love the results. It's a great way to stretch your dies and use them in a completely different way. My next technique is embossing on acetate. Embossing acetate gives a sleek, high-gloss look that's completely different from paper. I place a piece of acetate into my woven 3D embossing folder. This works best with a folder that has strong, defined lines. Then I run it through the machine. Acetate can crack if it's too brittle or if the sandwich is too tight, so make sure to use a lighter sandwich if your sandwich gives a lot of pressure. When it comes out, the design is cleanly pressed into the plastic, creating a shiny, dimensional effect that catches the light beautifully. I love using embossed acetate as an overlay, shaker window, or card front. It adds just enough interest without blocking what's behind it. Number 17. On to our last technique, Copic coloring. For this last technique, I'm combining Copic coloring with the embossed texture for a polished, dimensional look. I start by embossing a piece of Nina Classic Crest white cardstock using the Petunia Cascade embossing folder. Once the panel is embossed, I take my Copic markers and color the raised areas, the petals, leaves, and stems. I don't worry too much if I color outside the raised area. This technique is very forgiving. The embossed texture helps guide the coloring, and since Copics blend smoothly on this surface, I can easily add shading and depth to each element. Once I finish coloring, I place the panel back into the embossing folder, carefully lining it up again. Then I ink the opposite side of the folder with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink, using a light stamping motion. I close the folder and run it through the machine once more. This pushes dark ink into the background, creating contrast against the colorful raised design. This will also cover any areas where I colored outside of the raised area. The result is bold and striking, with vibrant coloring on top and rich black behind. It almost looks like a finished illustration. Now that we've explored all of those embossing folder techniques, let's take a quick look at how I turned these into finished cards. Each one uses the technique exactly as I showed it, but now you'll see how it comes to life in a complete design, with sentiments, embellishments, and all those little finishing touches that pull a card together. Whether you like clean and simple or bold and textured, these examples will give you lots of inspiration for using your embossing folders in creative ways. Let's take a closer look. I hope you enjoyed seeing all the ways you can use your embossing folders. Whether it's with vellum, ink, paste, or even acetate, there are so many fun ways to add texture to your cards. I've included a full supply list below, so if you're interested in any of the tools or materials I used in today's cards or techniques, you'll find everything linked there for easy reference. If you had a favorite technique, let me know in the comments. I love hearing what inspired you. I would also love to know which card was your favorite. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming videos. I post every Tuesday and Thursday. Tuesdays are my live stream days. I go live at 2 p.m. Eastern, and Thursdays feature brand new techniques just like this one. Thanks so much for watching and spending your time with me today. I hope this inspired you to try something new. Happy crafting, and I'll see you next time.